The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, but Robert Matthews barely noticed. He sat at the same oak table where he'd shared thousands of breakfasts with his wife Margaret, staring at the empty chair across from them, the Coffee Inn. His mug had gone cold an hour ago, but he couldn't bring himself to move. 6 months. It had been 6 months since Margaret lost her battle with cancer, and Robert still set 2 plates out of habit before catching himself. The house felt impossibly quiet without her humming while she cooked, without her gentle chatter about the neighbors or her plans for the garden. Now the garden sat overgrown, and Robert lived on whatever required the least effort. His daughter, called every other day from California, worry thick in her voice. "Dad, you need to eat properly. You need to take care of yourself. Mom wouldn't want this." His son from Texas echoed the same concerns during their weekly calls. Both had visited after the funeral, cleaned out the refrigerator, stocked it with fresh food, and watched helplessly as their once strong father seemed to shrink before their eyes. Robert knew they were right, but cooking for one person felt pointless. Everything reminded him of Margaret. The wooden spoons she'd used, the recipe cards written in her careful handwriting, even the smell of onion sautéing brought back memories so sharp they took his breath away. So he'd given up. Frozen dinners, toast, sometimes nothing at all. Last week, his daughter had delivered an ultimatum during their phone call. "Dad, I'm serious. Either you figure out how to take care of yourself, or I'm flying out there and we're looking at assisted living facilities. You've lost 20 pounds. This can't continue." The threat hung in the air long after she'd hung up. Robert looked around his home of 38 years at the photos of him and Margaret on the mantel, at her reading glasses still sitting on the side table. The thought of leaving, of being surrounded by strangers in some sterile facility, filled him with dread. That's when he'd gotten the idea. If he couldn't bring himself to cook, maybe someone else could. Not a housekeeper or a companion. He wasn't ready for someone trying to fill Margaret's place. Just someone to make meals. Simple, professional, temporary. He'd sat at Margaret's old secretary desk, the one she'd used to write letters and pay bills, and crafted what he thought was a straightforward advertisement. Widower seeking part-time cook, simple meals. Must be reliable, no companionship required. He'd added that last line deliberately, wanting to make it crystal clear that this was strictly business. The ad ran in the local newspaper for 3 days. Robert expected maybe a few responses from professional cooks or retired ladies looking for extra income. Instead, his phone barely rang. One woman called but hung up when he explained he didn't need housekeeping. Another wanted to bring her small children with her, which Robert immediately declined. By Friday, he was beginning to think the whole idea was foolish. Maybe his daughter was right. Maybe it was time to consider other options. He was contemplating calling her back when the phone rang one more time. "Hello, I'm calling about your cooking advertisement," said a warm voice with a slight accent. "My name is Elena Rodriguez." "I saw your ad in the paper." Robert straightened in his chair. "Yes, well, it's pretty straightforward. I need someone to cook a few meals a week. Nothing fancy. I understand. May I ask what kind of meals you prefer? Are there any foods you don't like or can't eat?" The question caught him off guard. Most people would have asked about pay or schedule first. I'm not picky, just regular American food, I suppose. Nothing too spicy." "That's wonderful. I love cooking comfort food." "How often would you need meals prepared?" "Twice a week." "Maybe enough for a few days each time?" Robert found himself relaxing slightly. Elena sounded professional but kind, not pushy like some of the other callers. "Would you prefer me to shop for groceries, or do you have preferences about where ingredients come from?" Again, a question he hadn't expected. "I usually shop at Peterson's Market on Main Street, have for years, they know me there. Peterson's has beautiful produce. I shop there myself sometimes." "When would be a good time for us to meet? I'd like to learn more about what you enjoy eating." Robert hesitated. Meeting her made it real, made it more than just a phone call he could easily back out of. But his daughter's words echoed in his mind, and his stomach reminded him that he'd had nothing but coffee and a stale donut today. "Tomorrow afternoon, around 2 o'clock? Perfect." What's your address? After hanging up, Robert sat in the quiet house and wondered what he'd just done. He'd managed to avoid having visitors since the funeral, turning down well-meaning neighbors and church members who wanted to check on him. Now he'd invited a stranger into his home, into the kitchen where Margaret had reigned for nearly 4 decades. He spent the next day in a state of nervous energy he hadn't felt in months. He actually showered and put on clean clothes, then worried that Elena might think he was trying to impress her. He straightened up the living room, then left it alone, then straightened it again. By 2 o'clock, he was second-guessing the entire decision. The doorbell rang at exactly 2, and Robert took a deep breath before opening it. Elena Rodriguez stood on his front porch holding a small notebook and wearing a friendly smile. She was shorter than he'd expected, with graying hair, pulled back neatly and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She looked like someone's aunt, comfortable and unthreatening. "Mr. Matthews? I'm Elena. Thank you for agreeing to meet with me. Come in, please." Robert stepped aside, suddenly aware of how dim and quiet his house seemed. "Would you like some coffee? I'm afraid I don't have much else to offer." "Coffee would be lovely, thank you." He led her to the kitchen, the heart of his home that had become his least favorite room. Elena looked around with interest but not judgment, taking in the clean but unused appliances, the empty counters, the general sense of a space that had lost its purpose. "This is a beautiful kitchen," she said genuinely. "Someone who loved cooking designed this space." Robert felt his throat tighten. "My wife, she did all the cooking. I was never much help in here." Elena nodded with understanding. "My grandmother always said that kitchens hold the heart of a home. They know when they're missed." Something about the way she said it, without pity or awkward sympathy, made Robert's shoulders relax a fraction. He poured coffee for both of them, and sat across from her at the table, Margaret's empty chair between them. "Tell me about the kind of meals you'd like," Elena said, opening her notebook. "Do you have favorite dishes? Things that make you feel good?" Robert found himself talking more than he had in weeks. About Margaret's pot roast, about Sunday morning pancakes, about the way she made grilled cheese sandwiches that somehow tasted better than anyone else's. Elena listened and took notes, asking gentle questions about seasonings and sides, about whether he preferred certain vegetables or had any health restrictions. "I can start this Tuesday if that works for you," she said finally. "I was thinking I could come twice a week, maybe Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, and prepare enough food for several days each time. Does that sound reasonable?" Robert nodded, surprised by how much better he felt just having a plan. "What do you charge?" She named a fair price and they worked out the practical details. Elena would do the grocery shopping and cooking, leaving meals with simple reheating instructions. She'd clean up after herself and be gone within a few hours. "One more thing," Robert said as she prepared to leave. "I want to be clear that I'm just looking for someone to cook. I'm not interested in companionship or conversation. This is strictly a business arrangement," Elena smiled gently. "I understand completely, Mr. Matthews. Sometimes we need to take care of the practical things first. Everything else can wait." After she left, Robert sat in his kitchen, feeling something he hadn't experienced in months, a small spark of hope. Maybe this would work? Maybe he could figure out how to keep living in this house, surrounded by memories but not drowning in them. He didn't realize it yet, but Elena Rodriguez was about to change his life in ways he never expected. All he knew was that for the first time in 6 months, he was actually looking forward to a home-cooked meal. Tuesday afternoon arrived with a gentle knock at the door. Robert had been pacing his living room for the past hour, checking his watch and wondering if Elena would actually show up. When he opened the door, she stood there with 2 canvas grocery bags and that same warm smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Matthews. I hope you're ready for some good food." Robert stepped aside to let her in, noting how she moved confidently into his kitchen as if she'd been there before. She began unpacking groceries with practiced efficiency, pulling out fresh vegetables, chicken breasts, and ingredients he hadn't seen in his kitchen for months. "I thought I'd start with some chicken and rice casserole today," Elena said, washing her hands at the sink. It's comfort food that reheats well, and I can make enough for 3 or 4 meals. Robert hovered awkwardly by the kitchen entrance, unsure of what to do with himself. I'll just be in my study if you need anything, he said, already backing toward the hallway. Of course, I'll let you know when I'm finished. He retreated to his study, closing the door behind him. But even with the door shut, he could hear Elena moving around his kitchen. The sound of running water, the gentle clatter of pots and pans, the soft humming of someone who enjoyed their work. It was the first time in months that his house had felt alive. Robert tried to focus on the crossword puzzle he'd been working on for 3 days, but his mind kept wandering. The aroma of onions and garlic drifting under his door made his stomach growl audibly. He couldn't remember the last time his house had smelled like actual cooking instead of reheated frozen meals. After what felt like hours, Elena knocked softly on his study door. Mr. Matthews? I'm just about finished. Could I show you what I've prepared? Robert found his kitchen transformed. The counters were clean, the dishes washed and put away, and several containers sat cooling on the stove. Elena had even wiped down surfaces he hadn't noticed were dirty. I made enough casserole for 4 servings, she explained, showing him the large glass dish. I also prepared some green beans with almonds and a small batch of cornbread. Everything reheats easily in the oven. She handed him a small piece of paper with neat handwriting. These are the reheating instructions. The casserole is best at 350 degrees for about 20 minutes. The green beans just need a few minutes in the microwave. Robert glanced at the note, then did a double take. At the bottom, Elena had written, "Your kitchen has good energy. It remembers being loved." What does this mean? He asked, pointing to the message. Elena looked slightly embarrassed. I'm sorry. I have a habit of writing little notes. My own children used to tease me about it. I can rewrite it if you prefer just the instructions. Robert studied the note again. Something about it bothered him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. It's fine, he said curtly, folding the paper and putting it in his pocket. Elena nodded and gathered her things. I'll see you Thursday then. Same time? After she left, Robert stood in his kitchen feeling oddly unsettled. The room looked better than it had in months, and the smell of home cooking lingered in the air. But Elena's comment about the kitchen, remembering being loved, felt too personal. Too knowing, he served himself a portion of the casserole that evening, expecting it to be adequate, but nothing special. The first bite surprised him. It was delicious, seasoned perfectly, and somehow exactly what he'd been craving without knowing it. For the first time in months, he cleaned his entire plate. Thursday came, and with it another knock at the door. This time, Elena carried a small potted plant along with her grocery bags. I noticed your windowsill looks a little bare, she said, setting the small herb plant on the kitchen counter. This is oregano. It's very hardy and smells wonderful, Robert frowned. I didn't ask for any plants. Of course not. It's just a small gift. If you don't want it, I can take it back. There was something in her tone that made Robert pause. Not hurt, exactly, but a gentle disappointment that made him feel petty. It's fine. It can stay? Elena began her work again, and Robert retreated to his study as before. But this time he found himself straining to hear what she was doing. The sound of chopping vegetables, the sizzle of something in a pan, the occasional clink of a spoon against a pot. It was strangely comforting. About an hour later, he heard something that made him freeze. Elena was humming. Not loudly, just a soft, unconscious melody as she worked. The tune was familiar, something Margaret used to hum while she cooked Sunday dinner. Robert felt a surge of anger that surprised him with its intensity. How dare this stranger come into his kitchen and hum Margaret's songs? How dare she make herself at home in the space that belonged to his wife's memory? He marched out of his study, ready to tell Elena to keep quiet, but stopped short when he saw her. She was standing at the stove stirring something in a large pot, and for just a moment from behind she looked like ... No, Robert shook his head sharply. She looked like a woman cooking dinner, nothing more. Is everything all right? Elena asked, turning to face him. The humming, Robert said stiffly. Could you please keep it down? I'm trying to concentrate. Elena's face flushed slightly. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize I was doing it. I'll be more careful. She turned back to the stove, and the kitchen fell silent except for the bubble of whatever she was cooking. Robert felt like a fool, but he couldn't bring himself to apologize. Instead, he returned to his study and tried to ignore the uncomfortable feeling in his chest. When Elena finished that day, she left another note with the reheating instructions. This one was strictly business. Beef stew, 350 degrees, 15 minutes. Biscuits, 5 minutes. Green salad in refrigerator. No personal comments, no observations about his kitchen or his life. Robert told himself he was satisfied with the arrangement. This was what he'd wanted after all. Professional, impersonal, efficient. But as he ate the beef stew that night, he found himself thinking about Elena's humming and wondering what song it had been. He also noticed that the small oregano plant on his windowsill caught the evening light in a way that made the whole kitchen look a little less empty. The following week brought the same pattern. Elena arrived on Tuesday with groceries and a cheerful greeting. She cooked quietly and efficiently, leaving perfectly prepared meals and business-like notes. No more personal observations, no more humming, no more small gifts. Robert should have been pleased. Instead, he felt oddly disappointed. The kitchen still smelled wonderful after her visits, and the food was still delicious, but something was missing. The space felt more like a commercial kitchen than the heart of a home. On Thursday of the second week, Robert made a decision that surprised him. Instead of hiding in his study, he poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table while Elena worked. "You don't have to stop what you're doing," he said when she looked at him questioningly. "I just thought I'd sit here for a bit." Elena nodded and continued chopping vegetables for what looked like a pot roast. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes before Robert spoke again. "That song you were humming last week, what was it?" Elena paused in her chopping. "I'm not sure. Maybe something my mother used to sing. I don't really think about it when I'm cooking." "I hope it wasn't too distracting." "It wasn't distracting," Robert said quietly. "It was ... familiar." Elena smiled softly. "Music has a way of carrying memories, doesn't it? Sometimes the old songs find us when we need them most." Robert felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of the tight knot that had lived there for months. "My wife used to hum while she cooked. I thought I'd forgotten what it sounded like." "Cooking is a form of love," Elena said gently, returning to her vegetables. "Maybe that's why the songs come naturally. They're part of the process." For the first time since Margaret's death, Robert didn't feel angry at the comparison. Instead, he felt a small measure of peace. Maybe having Elena in his kitchen wasn't about replacing Margaret or forgetting her. Maybe it was about remembering that love could take many forms, even the simple act of preparing food with care. He finished his coffee and stood to leave, but paused at the kitchen doorway. "Elena, you can hum if you want to. I don't mind." Elena's face lit up with a smile that transformed her entire expression. "Thank you, Mr. Matthews. That's very kind." As Robert walked back to his study, he heard the soft melody resume, and for the first time in months, it didn't hurt to listen. 3 weeks into their arrangement, Robert had settled into a routine he hadn't expected to enjoy. Tuesday and Thursday afternoons brought the sound of Elena's car in the driveway, followed by the comforting bustle of someone who knew her way around the kitchen. He'd even started timing his errands so he'd be home when she arrived, though he told himself it was just to make sure she had everything she needed. That Thursday started like any other. Elena knocked at 2 o'clock sharp, carrying her usual grocery bags and wearing a bright blue sweater that made her look younger somehow. Robert had been looking forward to her visit more than he cared to admit. The leftover chicken and dumplings from Tuesday had been the best meal he'd eaten in months. "Good afternoon, Mr. Matthews," Elena called out as she headed toward the kitchen. "I thought I'd make that pot roast you mentioned liking, the one your wife used to make on Sundays." Robert followed her, curious despite himself. Over the past week, he'd found himself sharing small details about Margaret's cooking, surprised by how good it felt to talk about those memories with someone who understood food the way his wife had. "She always said the secret was cooking it low and slow," Robert said, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "And she'd add a little coffee to the gravy. Don't ask me why, but it made all the difference. Elena paused in her unpacking, looking pleased. Coffee and gravy? That's brilliant. The bitterness would balance the richness perfectly. Your wife was clearly a talented cook. Something warm spread through Robert's chest at the praise. She really was. I never appreciated it enough when ... He stopped, surprised by how close he'd come to admitting something so personal. Elena continued her work without pressing him, but Robert could see the understanding in her eyes. She began browning the roast in Margaret's old Dutch oven, the same pot that had produced countless Sunday dinners over the years. Robert watched her work, noting how she handled the heavy pot with confidence, how she seasoned the meat with just a pinch of this and a dash of that, never measuring but somehow knowing exactly what was needed. It reminded him so much of Margaret that his chest tightened. "I think I'll get today's mail," he said abruptly. Needing some air, the November afternoon was crisp, with the kind of bite that promised winter wasn't far away. Robert walked slowly down his front path, in no hurry to return to the kitchen where Elena was making his house smell like home again. The mailbox was only 30 feet from his front door, but he was so lost in thought that he didn't notice the patch of ice on his front steps until it was too late. His feet went out from under him, and he hit the concrete steps hard. Pain shot through his left side, sharp and immediate. He lay there for a moment, stunned and embarrassed, hoping none of the neighbors had seen him sprawled on his own front walk like an old fool. "Mr. Matthews!" Elena's voice cut through his daze. She must have seen him fall from the kitchen window. "Don't move, just stay still." She was beside him in seconds, her hands gentle but sure as she checked him over. "Where does it hurt? Did you hit your head?" "My ribs," Robert gasped, trying to sit up. "I think I'm okay, just bruised my pride more than anything. Let me be the judge of that." Elena's voice was firm but kind. "Can you wiggle your fingers and toes? Good, now let's get you inside where it's warm, and then we're going to have a doctor look at you." Robert wanted to protest, to insist he was fine, but the pain in his side was sharp enough to make him dizzy. Elena helped him to his feet with surprising strength, supporting him as they made their way slowly back into the house. "I'm calling Dr. Peterson," she said, settling him into his favorite armchair in the living room. "How do you know who my doctor is?" Elena paused. "You mentioned him when we talked about your medication restrictions for cooking. You said Dr. Peterson told you to watch your salt intake." Robert was touched that she'd remembered such a small detail. "He'll just tell me to put ice on it and take some aspirin." "Maybe, but let's let him decide that." Elena was already dialing the number she'd found on the notepad by Robert's phone. "Dr. Peterson, this is Elena Rodriguez. I work for Robert Matthews, and he's had a fall." "Yes, I'll bring him in right now." Robert started to object that he could drive himself, but Elena gave him a look that reminded him of Margaret when she'd made up her mind about something. "My car's more comfortable than yours anyway," she said, helping him into his coat, "and I'm a better driver in traffic." The ride to Dr. Peterson's office was the first time Robert had been a passenger in a car since Margaret's funeral. Elena drove carefully but confidently, keeping up a gentle stream of conversation that distracted him from both the pain and his embarrassment. "I hope this doesn't mean I ruined your pot roast," he said as they pulled into the medical building's parking lot. Elena laughed, a sound that filled the car with warmth. "The pot roast is fine. I turned everything off before we left. It'll keep until we get back." Dr. Peterson's examination confirmed what Robert had suspected: bruised ribs. Nothing broken, but painful enough to make moving difficult for the next few days. The doctor prescribed rest and pain medication and gave Robert a lecture about being more careful on icy surfaces. "You're lucky you have someone looking out for you," Dr. Peterson said, nodding toward Elena, who was waiting in the reception area. "Falls can be serious at your age." Back at home, Elena insisted on helping Robert get settled before she finished cooking. She brought him a cup of tea and made sure he had everything he needed within reach. "You don't have to stay," Robert said, though he found himself hoping she would. "I can manage fine on my own." "I'm sure you can," Elena said, but I'd feel better finishing what I started. Besides, that pot roast needs at least another hour, and someone should keep an eye on it. She returned to the kitchen, and Robert could hear her moving around, the familiar sounds of cooking that had become such a comfort. But this time felt different. This time, Elena wasn't just his hired cook. She was someone who had dropped everything to take care of him. Someone who had remembered his doctor's name and driven him to get help without being asked. About an hour later, Elena appeared with a tray containing a bowl of the most delicious-smelling pot roast he'd ever encountered. "I added the coffee to the gravy just like you said," she told him, setting the tray on the side table next to his chair. "I hope I got it right." Robert took a bite and closed his eyes. It was perfect, tender, flavorful, and somehow exactly like Margaret's, but uniquely Elena's at the same time. "This is wonderful," he said, and meant it. "Better than I've had in years." Elena smiled, looking pleased. "I'm glad you like it. I made extra, so you'll have plenty for the next few days? While you're recovering." She started to gather her things, but Robert found himself speaking before he could stop himself. "Elena, would you Would you like to stay and have dinner with me? I hate to eat alone, and there's more than enough." Elena paused, her purse halfway to her shoulder. "Are you sure? I don't want to impose." "You're not imposing. After what you did for me today, it's the least I can offer." Elena set down her purse and smiled. "I'd like that very much." She fixed herself a plate and sat across from him in Margaret's old chair. For the first time in months, Robert wasn't eating alone. They talked about the food, about Elena's own experiences with cooking, about how she'd learned to make perfect gravy from her grandmother. "My grandmother always said that food tastes better when it's shared," Elena said, taking a sip of the coffee she'd made to go with dinner. She was right about most things. Robert looked across the table at this woman who had come into his life to cook his meals and ended up taking care of him in ways he hadn't expected. "Elena, I want you to know what you did today, coming with me to the doctor, making sure I was okay, that was above and beyond what I hired you for." Elena's eyes were warm as she met his gaze. "Taking care of people isn't really a job, Mr. Matthews. It's just what we do for each other when we care." The word care hung in the air between them, and Robert realized that somewhere in the past 3 weeks, this arrangement had stopped being strictly professional. Elena cared about him, and if he was honest with himself, he'd begun to care about her too. "Would you call me Robert?" he asked quietly. "I think we're past the point of being so formal." Elena's smile lit up her entire face. "I'd like that, Robert. And thank you for letting me stay for dinner. It's been a long time since I've had such good company for a meal." As they finished eating and Elena helped him clean up, Robert realized that his house no longer felt empty. For the first time since Margaret's death, it felt like home again. The weeks following Robert's fall brought a warmth to his house that he hadn't felt in almost a year. Elena had started staying for dinner regularly, and their conversations had grown longer and more personal. She'd told him about her divorce 8 years ago, about how she'd raised 2 children mostly on her own, and about the satisfaction she found in cooking for people who appreciated good food. Robert found himself looking forward to Tuesdays and Thursdays with an anticipation that surprised him. He'd even bought a new shirt, navy blue with thin white stripes, telling himself it was just because his old ones were getting worn. But deep down, he knew it was because Elena had once mentioned how nice blue looked with his gray hair. Their routine had become comfortable. Elena would arrive, they'd chat while she cooked, and then they'd share whatever meal she'd prepared. Sometimes she brought ingredients from her own kitchen, teaching him small tricks Margaret had never known. Other times, she'd ask him to tell her more about Margaret's recipes, listening with genuine interest as he described the way his wife had made Sunday morning pancakes or her famous apple pie. It was during one of these conversations that Elena mentioned her ex-husband casually, something she rarely did. "Tony never appreciated home cooking," she said, stirring a pot of soup that smelled like heaven. "He was always saying we should just order pizza or pick up something from the drive-thru. I used to think there was something wrong with me for caring so much about making meals from scratch." There's nothing wrong with caring about feeding people well, Robert said firmly. It's one of the most basic ways we show love. Elena paused. In her stirring, giving him a look he couldn't quite read. That's exactly what my grandmother used to say. The following Tuesday, Elena didn't come. Robert waited by the window, watching for her small blue car to turn into his driveway. 2:00 came and went, then 3. By 4:00 he was genuinely worried. Elena had never been late, let alone failed to show up entirely. She was the most reliable person he'd met in years. He tried calling her number, but it went straight to voicemail. His message was awkward and stilted. Elena, this is Robert. I just wanted to make sure you're okay. Call me when you get this. Thursday came with no word from Elena. Robert found himself pacing the house, checking his phone every few minutes, looking out the window hopefully every time he heard a car on the street. The silence felt louder than it had even in those first weeks after Margaret's death. By Friday morning, Robert was genuinely frightened. Had something happened to Elena? Was she hurt? Sick? Had he done something wrong, said something to offend her? He replayed their last conversation over and over, trying to figure out what might have changed. His daughter called that afternoon, her weekly check-in, and Robert found himself telling her about Elena for the first time. Dad, you sound worried about her, his daughter said gently. She must mean a lot to you. The observation hit Robert like a physical blow. Elena did mean a lot to him. Somewhere in the past 2 months, she'd become more than just someone who cooked his meals. She'd become someone whose absence left a hole in his day, whose laugh made his house feel alive, whose care and attention had slowly brought him back to the land of the living. I think I'm falling in love with her, Robert said quietly, the words surprising him as much as they clearly surprised his daughter. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Dad, that's wonderful. Mom would want you to be happy, but would she? Robert spent the weekend wrestling with guilt, he thought. He'd moved past. Was loving Elena a betrayal of Margaret's memory? Could his heart hold room for both women without diminishing what he'd shared with his wife? On Monday morning, Elena finally called. Her voice sounded tired and strained. Robert, I'm so sorry I didn't call sooner. There's been a family emergency. My ex-husband had a heart attack, and I'm in Phoenix helping with my grandchildren while he recovers. Relief flooded through Robert so intensely that he had to sit down. Are you okay? Is there anything I can do? I'm fine, just tired. But Robert, I don't know when I'll be able to come back. Tony's recovery is going to take weeks, maybe months, and my daughter needs help with the kids. I'm so sorry to leave you without notice like this. Don't apologize, Robert said, though his heart was sinking. Family comes first? I understand completely. I'll call you as soon as I know more about my plans, Elena promised. And Robert, I've been thinking about you, about our dinners together. I hope you know how much they've meant to me. After she hung up, Robert sat in his kitchen feeling more alone than he had since those first dark weeks after Margaret's funeral. The house seemed to echo with emptiness. Even the small organelle plant on his windowsill looked sad for the first few days. He tried to maintain the routine Elena had helped him establish. He went to Peterson's Market and bought ingredients for simple meals, attempting to recreate some of the dishes she'd taught him. But cooking for one person felt pointless again, and most of his attempts ended up in the garbage dump by the end of the first week. Robert realized something profound had happened to him. Elena's absence wasn't just inconvenient or disappointing. It was devastating. He missed her laugh, her gentle observations about life, the way she made even the simplest meal feel like a celebration. He missed having someone to talk to who really listened, someone who cared whether he ate well or took his medications. Most surprising of all, he missed having someone to take care of. Elena had always appreciated his small gestures, the way he'd set the table before she arrived, or remember how she liked her coffee, or ask about her daughter's new job. He'd forgotten how good it felt to matter to someone, to have his attention and care welcomed rather than simply endured. That weekend, Robert did something he'd been avoiding for months. He went into the bedroom he'd shared with Margaret and opened her closet. Her clothes still hung there, untouched since her death, Still carrying the faint scent of her perfume, he spent the afternoon going through her things, not with the desperate grief that had kept him away before, but with love and gratitude for the years they'd shared. He kept her wedding ring, some photographs, and the cookbook she'd inherited from her mother. The rest he carefully packed for donation, talking to Margaret as he worked. "I think you'd like Elena," he said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish. "She's kind like you were, and she makes me want to be better than I've been. I hope that's okay." The next day, Robert called Elena. She sounded surprised but pleased to hear from him. "How are you managing?" she asked. "Are you eating well?" "I'm getting by," Robert said, though they both knew it was probably not entirely true. "But Elena, I need to tell you something. These past 2 weeks without you have made me realize how much you mean to me. It's not just about the cooking anymore." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Robert's heart started to race. Had he said too much? Had he misread the signs? "Robert," Elena said softly, "I've been thinking the same thing. Being away from you, from our dinners and conversations, has made me realize that I've fallen in love with you. I was afraid to say anything because I didn't know how you felt." "I love you too," Robert said, the words feeling both foreign and perfectly natural. "I love your laugh and your kindness and the way you make my house feel like home again. When are you coming back?" "Soon," Elena promised. "Tony's doing better, and my daughter has found some local help. I should be home by the end of next week." "And Robert?" "When I get back, we need to talk about what this means for us." "I'd like that very much," Robert said, smiling genuinely for the first time in weeks after hanging up. Robert looked around his empty kitchen and began planning the meal he would cook for Elena when she returned. For the first time since Margaret's death, he was looking toward the future with hope and anticipation. Love, he realized, didn't have an expiration date. It could surprise you at any age, in any circumstance, when you least expected it and most needed it. Elena returned on a Thursday afternoon in late January, almost 6 weeks after she'd left for Phoenix. Robert had been watching for her car since noon, checking the window every few minutes like a teenager waiting for his first date, when her familiar blue sedan finally turned into his driveway. His heart jumped in a way that made him feel both foolish and wonderfully alive. He opened the door before she could knock, and they stood there for a moment just looking at each other. Elena looked tired but happy, her cheeks pink from the cold. Robert had rehearsed what he wanted to say during the long weeks she'd been gone, but now all his carefully planned words disappeared. "Hi," he said simply. "Hi yourself," Elena replied, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I missed you so much." Before Robert could lose his nerve, he stepped forward and wrapped her in a gentle hug. She felt smaller than he remembered, but warm and real and perfectly right in his arms. "I missed you too," he whispered into her hair, "more than I thought possible." They pulled apart slowly, both smiling and slightly embarrassed by the intensity of the moment. "How's your ex-husband?" Robert asked as they walked toward the kitchen. "Much better. He'll make a full recovery, thanks to some stubborn grandchildren who insisted he follow doctor's orders." Elena laughed, setting down her purse. "And my daughter finally found a wonderful nanny who'll help with the kids. I was able to come home." Home. The word hung between them, full of meaning neither of them had quite acknowledged yet. "Elena," Robert said, his voice more serious now, "these past weeks apart have given me a lot of time to think about us, about what this means." Elena nodded, settling into the chair across from him at the kitchen table. "I've been thinking too. Being away from you made me realize that what we have is real. But Robert, I need to know where you see this going. I need to know if you're ready for something more than just dinner companions." Robert had been dreading and anticipating this conversation for weeks. "I won't lie to you. I feel guilty sometimes. Like maybe loving someone new means I'm forgetting Margaret or being disloyal to her memory." Elena reached across the table and took his hand. "Do you really think love works that way? That there's only so much to go around?" "No," Robert said. After a moment, "I've realized that Margaret would want me to be happy. She'd probably be frustrated that it took me so long to figure that out." He squeezed Elena's hand. I love you, Elena, not because you remind me of Margaret, but because you're exactly who you are. You brought light back into my life when I thought I'd lost it forever." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "I love you too, Robert. I love your quiet strength and your kindness and the way you've learned to open your heart again. But I need you to know that I'm not trying to replace Margaret or be her. I want to build something new with you." "I wouldn't want you to be anyone but yourself," Robert said firmly. "You've made me realize that the heart doesn't have to choose between honoring the past and embracing the future. It can do both." Over the following months, Robert and Elena navigated their new relationship with the careful tenderness of two people who understood how precious and fragile love could be. Elena continued cooking for Robert, but now she stayed for every meal. They took walks around the neighborhood, visited farmers' markets together, and slowly introduced each other to their families. Robert's children were initially surprised, but ultimately supportive. His daughter flew in from California specifically to meet Elena, and Robert watched nervously as the two most important women in his life sized each other up over coffee and homemade apple pie. "Dad seems like himself again," his daughter told Elena privately. "Actually, he seems happier than he's been in years, even before Mom got sick. Thank you for that." Elena's children were equally welcoming, relieved to see their mother's face light up when she talked about Robert. Her son joked that he'd never seen her fuss so much over what to wear, while her daughter simply said she'd never heard her mother laugh so much. By spring, they'd settled into a rhythm that felt both comfortable and exciting. Robert started helping Elena in the kitchen, learning techniques he'd never bothered with during his marriage. Elena introduced him to foods he'd never tried, expanding his palate and his sense of adventure. "You know," Elena said one evening as they prepared dinner together, "I never expected to fall in love again. After my divorce, I thought that part of my life was over." "I know exactly what you mean," Robert replied, carefully chopping vegetables. The way she'd taught him. "At our age, you don't expect second chances." "Maybe that's what makes them so special," Elena said, bumping his shoulder playfully. "We know how rare they are." In June, almost a year after Elena had first answered his advertisement, Robert asked her to marry him. He didn't plan it or rehearse it. They were sitting in his backyard after dinner, watching the fireflies dance among the tomato plants Elena had helped him grow, when the words just came out. "Elena, will you marry me?" She turned to look at him, her eyes wide with surprise and joy. "Are you sure? Really sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Robert said, taking her hands in his. "I want to spend whatever time I have left making you happy and letting you make me happy. I want to wake up next to you and go to sleep holding your hand and argue with you about whether the coffee is too strong." Elena laughed through her tears. "The coffee is always too strong. And yes, Robert Matthews, I will absolutely marry you." They decided on a small ceremony in Robert's backyard, the same garden where Elena had first noticed the potential for new growth. Robert's children flew in, along with Elena's family and a handful of close friends. The local pastor, who had married Robert and Margaret 40 years earlier, agreed to perform the ceremony. The morning of the wedding, Robert stood in front of his bathroom mirror adjusting his tie. On the dresser behind him sat a small framed photo of Margaret, one he'd placed there the night before. "I hope you approve," he said to her picture. "I think you two would have been friends. She makes me laugh the way you used to, and she takes care of me without making me feel helpless. I'll always love you, but I'm ready to love her too." The ceremony was perfect in its simplicity. Elena looked radiant in a pale blue dress that brought out her eyes. Robert's hands shook only slightly as he slipped the ring onto her finger. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering erupted in applause and happy tears. During their first dance to music played on Elena's phone, Robert whispered in her ear, "You know, I hired you just to cook for me." Elena smiled up at him. "And I only answered your ad because I needed the work. Funny how life works out, isn't it?" "The best things always come when you're not looking for them," Robert replied, spinning her gently around the makeshift dance floor. As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, Robert and Elena sat on his back porch swing, Elena's head resting on Robert's shoulder. The house behind them glowed with warm light, and the garden around them hummed with life. "So what happens now?" Elena asked softly. "Now we get to find out what happily ever after looks like for two people who thought they'd missed their chance," Robert said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Elena snuggled closer to her new husband, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I think it's going to be wonderful." And as they sat together in the growing darkness, surrounded by the scent of Elena's flowers and the promise of countless tomorrows, Robert couldn't help but agree. Sometimes the most beautiful stories began not with once upon a time, but with a simple advertisement in the newspaper and the courage to let love find you when you least expected it.